Hello everybody! Today I'm going to talk about some books I've read lately, and I'm using the term lately pretty loosely. I was supposed to do one of these videos in December, but it kept getting pushed off. Number one, because I had lots of other things to do, and number two, because I would be reading a book, and I would say, well, I'll do the recent reads video after I finish reading this. And then I would finish it and move right on to the next book, and so then I would say, okay, I'll do it after I read this one, and so on. Rinse and repeat. So here we are, like 2 months later, and I've got a whole bunch of books to talk about, and I can't remember all of the details of all of them, so this is going to be interesting. First up, going all the way back to November, I think, I read Rose Under Fire by Elizabeth Wein? I'm still not sure how to correctly pronounce the author's last name, which I know is ironic because it starts with the same 3 letters as my YouTube name. I don't know how to correctly pronounce that either. I say Weaselberry, I've heard Weiselberry. That's fine. It's a made-up name, so it doesn't really matter. This book is the follow-up to Codename Verity, which I reviewed some time ago. Both books are historical fiction set in World War II about girls who work as auxiliary pilots for the RAF. Codename Verity gets into special covert operations in the French underground and the German imprisonment of British spies. But this book is about an American pilot who comes to England to assist with transport flights. She accidentally is taken prisoner by the Germans and sent to Ravensbrück concentration camp, where she encounters the rabbits, mutilated victims of Nazi experimentation. It is a depressing story, as any story that takes place at Ravensbrück is bound to be, but it is inspiring with a good ending. It didn't quite stab me in the gut the way the climax of Codename Verity did. I don't think it's crucial that you read Codename Verity first, but the book does include some emotional references to pivotal characters and events that happened in Codename Verity, so you get a fuller reading experience if you start with that one. But they're both very good books, and I have a hard time deciding which one I liked better. After that, I read a horror anthology called Flight or Fright, edited by Stephen King and Bev Vincent. I checked this one out of the library on an impulse, which is not something I usually do, and it was a good reminder of why I don't usually do that. It wasn't a great collection, and I would have known that if I had looked at reviews of it beforehand. A collection of spooky stories about flying and planes is a great concept, and I feel like how could you go wrong with this, but I only liked a few of the stories that were included. Richard Matheson's Nightmare at 20,000 Feet was probably my favorite story in the collection, and I was already familiar with it from the very famous Twilight Zone episode. So, on the whole, this collection was not very satisfying. I also read, just before Christmas, Mystery in White by Jefferson Farjeon. I have no idea if I'm saying that correctly. I think this one's gotten quite a bit of buzz around BookTube in the last year, which is funny because it's not a new book. It was originally published in 1937, but it got a reissue in 2014 with an attractive Murder on the Orient Expressian cover, which of course caught everyone's attention. It's a Christmassy murder mystery in which a group of passengers is stranded on a train during a storm. They leave the train and they end up snowbound at a house kind of in the middle of nowhere where someone's been murdered. This one has a great Christmassy, snowy atmosphere, but the rest of it was kind of a letdown for me. It definitely imitates the feel of a classic Agatha Christie novel, think The Mousetrap and Then There Were None, and a host of others, but it doesn't quite reach Agatha Christie's golden standard. For me, the biggest things I didn't like about it were that the paranormal aspect felt really shoved in there, and I really didn't like Mr. Maltby, the pseudo-detective figure who is responsible for shoving in the paranormal aspect. He was eccentric and arrogant and long-winded, and most of the time he was wrong about his theories, and so every time he entered the scene I was like, oh boy, here we go. The last book I read in 2018 was another work of World War II historical fiction, this one a little bit more of a romance. It's The Morning Gift by Eva Ibbotson. This is the second Ibbotson book that I've read. The first one was A Company of Swans, and I liked this one better. It's about a Viennese girl named Ruth, who is the last of her family to leave Austria before Hitler's forces take over. Ruth's chances of fleeing are dwindling when she runs into a family acquaintance, an English professor. He offers his assistance, but to their mutual discomfort, the best solution is for her to leave the country as his wife. She agrees to this on the condition that the marriage be annulled as soon as they reach England, as she's eager to marry her longtime love, a gifted pianist. In England, Ruth reunites with her family in the downtrodden refugee village, and she gets accepted to the university where her secret husband, the professor, works. Unfortunately, there's a complication with the annulment, which begins to make their situation awkward, which you can see coming from pretty early on, but the way things develop from there is interesting. I enjoyed this one quite a bit. The characters are lively, the plot is entertaining. As I was reading it, I was impressed with how well researched the period seemed to be, and then afterward I found out that Ibbotson herself fled Vienna in the 1930s, so a lot of this is based on her own experience. My biggest complaint with the story is that the climactic conflict is driven by a big misunderstanding, which is always such a frustrating thing. People just talk to each other. You'd solve your problems much faster if you would communicate better, but it all works out well in the end, so I didn't mind it too much. I also read Rainbow Valley, the second to last book in the Anne series by Ellen Montgomery, but I'm going to skip that for now. I am almost done with my reread of the series, and when I finish, I guess I'll review the whole thing. Another book I read was Still Life with Crows, the fourth book in the Pendergast series by Douglas Preston and Lincoln Child. I am slowly making my way through this series, and the results have been mixed. I have felt like I enjoyed each book less than the one before, but this one was different. I enjoyed this one just as much as the first one, Relic, if not more. This time, Agent Pendergast comes to a dying Kansas town to investigate a murder that seems indicative of a violent serial killer. The use of setting in this book is fantastic. The setting sets up the mood, it pervades the atmosphere, it gives you great places to stage scary scenes. There's an end of summer heat wave, there's a storm coming, which of course breaks at the climactic point. There are all these dry cornfields, there's a turkey slaughtering factory, there are all these huge caverns and labyrinths underground. It's just a perfect place to have a scary book about a serial killer. I am still pretty squeamish, though, when it comes to some of the grosser parts, especially the very detailed autopsy scenes. I don't know why they have to be so detailed, but that does come with the territory. These are horror mysteries, after all, and this one was scary. But it also had some good emotional components and interesting characters, and I really enjoyed the relationship that develops between Pendergast and the 18-year-old goth girl who everyone in town writes off as a juvenile delinquent, but who is actually really smart and responsible, and Pendergast is the only one who can see it. That was a really cool, unexpected dynamic that developed between them, and I am hoping to see more of that in future books. I also read, after some deliberation, Unmasked, Andrew Lloyd Webber's memoir, which is really more of a partial memoir as it only covers his life up to Phantom's opening night in 1986. His writing is surprisingly direct at times and rather funny. I learned a lot about his professional and personal successes and failures, and I enjoyed getting to know him not as the musical composer extraordinaire, but as a pretty regular guy who just loves what he does. Something this book made me realize, or maybe reminded me of is a better way to put it, is just how much I do enjoy his music. Not just Phantom, which is my favorite musical, but a lot of his other stuff. He actually talks a lot about the making of the demo recordings, which were released before the shows went into production. These are the songs that had radio play and became hits before the shows actually premiered on the West End or on Broadway. And oddly enough, these are the versions of some of his biggest songs that I grew up being most familiar with, because this CD was like one of the soundtracks of my childhood. This is the premiere collection, and it has 14 tracks. They are the demo recordings. I didn't know that at the time. It was only after I got into Phantom that I learned that the version of the Phantom of the Opera with Sarah Brightman and Steve Harley and all those wailing electric guitars is not the version, not exactly the version that's in the show. This is my mom's CD, but it migrated into my collection a few years ago, and seems unlikely that it's going to migrate back. Sorry, Mom. Anyway, got a little off track there. The book is pretty long, especially considering that it's like volume 1 of his memoirs. He's not sure if he'll ever write a volume 2, and some of it is too much information. But I did learn to speed through all the stuff that didn't interest me as much. What I really wanted was the behind-the-scenes details of how he got inspiration for his music, and the development of the shows, and the production themselves. And definitely the best part for me, as I think it would be for any fan, is when he talks about the Phantom of the Opera. I made the mistake of reading the last chapter where he talks about opening night and how everything went so magically right just before I went to bed. And I was so excited and exhilarated by just the talk of it all that I could hardly go to sleep. I guess that's how you know you're a fan. Following that, I finally read Kazuo Ishiguro's The Remains of the Day. I did see the Merchant Ivory film with Anthony Hopkins and Emma Thompson several years ago, but fortunately it's been long enough, or my memory is sketchy enough, that the story felt almost new to me as I read it. For instance, while I remembered how it handles aging and a devoted servant's stubbornness about relinquishing his duties, I managed to completely forget that it had anything to do with World War II, so that whole aspect of the story, which is a pretty major part of it, was all new to me. This is one of those stories where your perception of what's going on changes once you learn to start reading between the lines. And it's also a great example of how a story can be dry and matter-of-fact, almost pedantically so, and yet still be totally engrossing, an aching story of unrequited love. And the last book that I completed was The Ordinary Princess by MMK. This one's a very charming fairy tale in which the author sets out to tell the story of a princess who does not have all the stereotypical perfect beauty and whatnot that princesses are expected to be born with. It's another book that's been sitting on my to-read list for several years, but I got spurred into reading it a few weeks ago when a friend of mine read it and really enjoyed it. It makes some tongue-in-cheek references to its predecessors, which was hilarious. It's got good characters, it's entertaining, it's got a little romance, and it's a kid's book, so it only took a couple hours to read. Not that that's a reason for reading anything, but hey, you know, when you have a goal for how many books you want to read by the end of the year, well, it's an incentive. So if you're a fan of fairy tales, you should check it out. And lastly, 2 books that I am currently reading that I probably will have finished by the time I post this video. The Encyclopedia of Monsters by Daniel Cohen, which was recommended to me by Mountains Out of Molehills. This is a cryptozoology reference book, which is a really interesting read if you like to learn about things like that every now and then, as I do. This would have been a great resource for my 9th grade research paper on cryptozoology. Each creature or monster or legend or being of dubious or unproven existence is given a separate entry. As you might expect, the ones that are a little more prominent, more famous, more well-known, get more of a spotlight, but I was satisfied with Cohen's consistency, his thoroughness, and his handling of the material. I was initially surprised to find out that the Chupacabra was not included in this book, as that's like one of the big daddies of cryptozoology now, but then I realized that the book's publication in 1982 predates the first official sighting of the Chupacabra, which I think was in the mid-90s, so since it came out in the early 80s, there is a strong possibility that a lot of these, I was going to call them characters, that a lot of these creatures' stories have had updates to them. That's what the internet is for. There were a lot of times where I was like, oh, let me just look up this thing to see a picture of it or to find out more about it, see if there's been any updates. So, yeah, it was a lot of fun reading it. And the other book I'm currently reading, which I'm almost done with, is False Scent, a Roderick Alleyn mystery by Ngaio Marsh. I had 3 of these unread on my shelf, and it was more than time for me to read at least one of them, and now I'm kicking myself for not doing it sooner because it's only reminded me how much I love this detective series. Okay, that's it everyone. This video has turned out to be longer than I intended. Maybe I'll learn my lesson and not let so much time go by before I do the next one. Or maybe I won't and I'll do the exact same thing again. I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching!